slowly at the moment. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today for our now stand talk. For today's stand talk, should be a very good one with Kariuki, and we're just about halfway through the speaker series for the winter season, and it's been pretty fun so far, pretty interesting, and it's nice. It's been great, at least for me, to have this little moment to meet together with you and with others to chat and listen and think. So thanks again, everyone, for coming here today. And we have an exciting lineup still to go for the next few weeks, but nothing more exciting for now than today's talk with Kariuki. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess soon if you'll welcome Kariuki, many of you very well might know Kariuki, but for those who do not, he's a PhD candidate at the University of McGill, a star member of ICANN, and he has some fresh and interesting research to talk about today, things he's been working on sort of as it's going. And that's one thing I love about STandD is you can, I mean, I guess you could do this anywhere, but with STandD, at least you can present something that you've been working on for several years and that's been maturing and finally share with others, or you can present something that really is kind of emerging now, and it's happening as you're thinking about it. So it's a good format for, you know, sharing at all sorts of steps of the way. So without any further ado, please, Kariuki, take on the show, and it is yours.
All right, welcome everyone. Just give me a minute to send my notes to my other computer because OneDrive decided to be a bit slower than myself, actually. So I'd like to welcome everyone again. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you everyone for showing up. Today's talk is, I find it very exciting for me personally, because first of all, I remember when I came to McGill, one of the first talks I had was at STandD, and now I think this one is, I could as well say this, I see it as my last talk at STandD as a PhD candidate at McGill. Hoping that positive everything goes well with the final stages of the completing the dissertation and the program overall. So I take that personally that this moment I consider to be quite important, a way of connecting with people I've been with for many, many years, and probably a way to sign off as well. And just to add to some of what Nick has said about myself, I would like to just add that I work under the supervision of John Galati, and my doctoral research is focused mainly on the processes of land governance and conservation among the Maasai of Olderkesi in Narok County, who are mainly a pastoral group. And previously, I have focused on land governance issues, local development issues, and overall, I've engaged with questions of how to improve the quality of life in Kenya and sub-Saharan Africa at large. So today's presentation is an attempt to build on these experiences and engagements that have taken me to, fortunately, to different African countries, and as well to European and now North America. Here we are, despite being locked down. So I hope that that journey can somehow find its way to today's discussion. The overarching question for today is whether the ongoing conservation efforts, part of what I'm looking at in Kenya, in the East and Southern Africa generally, are catalyzing land losses among the local and indigenous communities. And in my case, as I've said, the pastoral Maasai people through what has sometimes been called green grabbing, which is usually converting land for conservation purposes. So in my attempt to understand what is really going on, I set out to situate the unfolding events both historically and ontologically in order to reflects on the dialectic of how life is simultaneously valued and devalued, and as well the conditions and institutions that are critical in organizing the parameters of this, what we may call the dialectical interplay of valuing and devaluing life. So to do this, I'll be building or leaning on and learning from Cedric Robinson's work called Black Marxism. And I will just share my screen with you for the slides that I have. Right. So I'll be building on Cedric Robinson's work on this talk that I've titled Losing Land to Gain Conservation, Disciplining Pastoral Livelihoods in the Racial Capitalocene. So I'll be trying to focus on the question of land, the question of conservation, the question of what kind of this disciplining we're talking about, and as well, what exactly I try to get at with racial capitalocene. Of course, many of you have engaged with the concept of racism, concepts of capitalism, but I think when it comes to racial capitalism, it's something I haven't seen being engaged with as much. So I think my notes have arrived on the other computer, and I should be well placed now to multitask with two screens. And let me just maximize this for the comfort of your view. Right. So the starting point here for me is to first introduce someone I've come to really admire and like. Unfortunately, Cedric Robinson passed on in 2016. He was born in 1940. And he pursued his education at UC Berkeley in socio-anthropology. He was a political activist. And for those of you who have probably followed Malcolm X's discussions and conversations, he was one of those who helped to bring Malcolm X to UC Berkeley campus in the 1960s. That discussion, you can find it on YouTube. And then he went on to do his doctorate studies at Stanford University. He has written extensively on Black social movements and racial capitalism. And I see him as, his work has inspired me to think about conservation issues that we've tried to talk about, within the ICANN project, the institutional canopy of conservation that we work under John Galati with partners in East Africa, and as well with Cicada, covering lives of different indigenous peoples around the world. And this kind of a globalizing of conservation and its consequences, and attempts to think about what are the connecting linkages between conservation and indigenous livelihoods. I find the work of Cedric Robinson, thinking with the concept of racial capitalism, to be quite instructive. And I hope today my attempt to explore this theoretically will be successful, and hopefully as well provoke some questions for discussion, because as I say, this is still formative work that I hope will develop into a more concrete framework and work. So this is a book I'm talking about, that's Racial Capitalism, the Making of Black Radical Tradition. And this work is a critique of Marxist theory. So I know reading the title, it comes off as maybe, oh, now we're going to think like Marx, but now from a Black perspective. But it's nothing like that at all. It's work that tries to position Black history or African history in a way that challenges Marxist traditional Marxist theory. And so that by doing so, Cedric Robinson can be able to basically show Black people's history of resistance and how it has been different to the kind of resistance that Karl Marx tries to argue for or tries to advance through the proletariat in the eventual takeover through a communist revolution. So finally, my notes are here. So one computer is older and the other one is newer. So we are working with two timers here. So in this book, Cedric Robinson demonstrates that efforts to understand Black people's history of resistance solely from the prism of Marxist theory are incomplete and inaccurate. So Marxist analysis tend to presuppose European models of history and experience that downplay the significance of Black people in Black communities as agents of change and resistance, and fails to account for the racial character of capitalism. He characterized Black rebellions as expressions of what he called the Black radical tradition, and his use of racial capitalism was greatly inspired by the apartheid regime in South Africa. So he wrote this work, part of this work when he was on sabbatical in the UK, in Britain. So building on the work of Oliver Cox, Robinson challenges the idea that capitalism was a revolutionary negation of feudalism, noting that instead, capitalism emerged within the feudal order and flowered in the cultural soil of Western civilization, already thoroughly infused with racialism. So capitalism and racism did not break from the old order, but rather evolved from it to produce a modern world system of racial capitalism that was dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. Capitalism was not racial because of some conspiracy to justify slavery and dispossession through enclosures, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. I think at this point, this argument or this statement is quite powerful when it comes as well to think about discussions about racism, where we see a lot of talk about, it's because of the color of my skin. And here, Cedric Robinson is challenging this idea that it's not about the color of the skin. It's racialism and racism have been there before capitalism. And so the emergence of capitalism was within that structure that was where racism was already infused. So, and that was already in Europe. So it was not with the Black encounter that the birth of racism was, occurred. So to build on that European history, again, just to think with Black Marxism here and seeing the focus that's on Europe, that's the focus that has been given on Europe, Robinson suggested that racialization within Europe was very much a colonial process involving invasion, settlement, expropriation, and racial hierarchy, insisting that modern European nationalism was completely bound up with racialist myths. He reminds us that the ideology of Herrenvolk that drove German colonization of Central Europe and Slavic territories explained the inevitability and the naturalness of the domination of some Europeans by other Europeans. So Herrenvolk here being a concept of domination through belonging to a certain ethnic group. So to acknowledge this history of racism is not to diminish anti-Black racism or African slavery, but rather to recognize that capitalism was not the great modernizer giving birth to the European proletariat as a universal subject, and the tendency of European civilization through capitalism was thus not to homogenize, but to differentiate. It was to exaggerate regional, subcultural, ethnic, and dialectical differences, all of them into racial ones, so into racial differences. All of them were being converged into a racial differentiation. So what concerns us is that we understand that racialism and its permutations persisted, rooted not in a particular era, but in the civilization itself. And though our era might seem a particularly fitting one for depositing the origins of racism, that judgment merely reflects how resistant the idea is to examination that is the idea of racism is resistant to examination, and how powerful and natural its specifications have become. And so with this work, by providing this history, this critical history, Cedric Robinson makes the argument that in order for us to realize a new theory, we require new history. That is, for the realization of new theory, we require new history. So my key argument then, given this background, is that capitalism was racial from its inception, and its corollaries are the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and colonialism were racist projects. The institutions emerging during this period have been reproduced over time to continue permeating local and indigenous spaces in sub-Saharan Africa, capturing these lives and livelihoods in colonial and post-colonial settings. So as Robin Kelley, who I consider to be one of the best readers of, and one of the most engaged scholars with Robinson's work, says that a non-racial capitalism does not exist. We should not even try to look for one. A non-racial capitalism does not exist. The continued expansion of capitalism through global neoliberal institutions is a concern of my presentation today, and I explore these dynamics by looking at the workings of conservation. So I'll mainly focus on conservation by way of looking at land governance issues, and as I say, focusing mainly on the East and Southern Africa, where wildlife conservancies function as a key site of analysis for my presentation today. So I think this background positions as well to engage with the concepts of, for instance, the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, as well as the concept of racism in the world and the world of conservation in particular. So also at this point, I think I should give a shout out to the Racial Justice Working Group within the Anthropology Graduate Students Association at McGill University, who we've been working with since last summer and continuing to engage with these issues. So I see this work kind of transcending the conservation debates and going further to current work that we are engaged in. So part of the discussions that have made conservation so important and so pertinent to our time, I trace the recent history of global discussions on this to the Brundtland report, with a report titled Our Common Future, which basically suggested that sustainable development in the way that it was being practiced needed to take into consideration the well-being of current generations and future generations, but doing so in a way that current generations did not compromise the well-being of future generations. So this thinking was with the realization that there was overexploitation of planetary resources, and by following on that path, future generations would be the future and lives of future generations will be compromised because current generations are overexploiting planetary resources. So these are some of the, in terms of recent history, where some of these discussions to think about, the planet, the resources, and climate change have come in. And so I chose this as a starting point just to take us back a little bit to see how things have evolved over time. So the topic of climate change has attracted broad public attention, and not least with the recent publication of Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So it's gone beyond the academic circles to involve the corporate and others who are outside of the academic circles. And this is basically a demonstration to me that these discussions are as well. If we think about capitalism, as you've said, as being racial, now we're seeing other parameters that are being given consideration, not just because we affect certain groups, but now the way of living life in the world has come to bite basically everyone in the world, and so it becomes a concern for everyone to think about these issues. So in terms of developing the concepts to think through, what is going on with climate change and the planet, endangering the planet, One of the leading scholars in these discussions have been Jason Moore, who says that actually, unlike the way Bill Gates has mainly focused on greenhouse gases and all that, and climate change, Jason Moore says that the news is not good on planet Earth. Humanity and the rest of life with it is now on the threshold of what Earth system scientists call a state shift. But our moment involves far more than bad climate. We're living through a transition in planetary life with the potential to transform Earth rapidly and irreversibly into a state unknown in human experience. So in terms of these attempts to make sense of what's going on and to intelligibly come up with concepts or theoretical frameworks that can help us to pin down the complexity of climate change and beyond climate change, the planetary changes that are occurring, has been one of the popular terms has been the Anthropocene, and it was coined by the ecologist Eugene Stromer at the University of Michigan. And then it mainly gained popularity with Dutch Nobel Prize winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen in early 2000s. So Anthropocene has been popularized as an epoch where basically humans are seen as a major geological force. And Jason Moore criticizes or basically describes Anthropocene as making sense of what's going on in the world through what he calls the green arithmetic. That is by seeing global challenges as a result of what the planetary crisis is being constituted of human action and nature. So this division of humans and nature, whereby humans are seen as anthropocentric agents that are over-exploiting the planet. So, but Anthropocene has been criticized broadly, and these are some of the criticisms, and there are more. But I thought I could mention a few. So the first one is that the Anthropocene is very much anthropocentric, focused on human exceptionalism, and basically tends to direct us to narrow our focus when we have to think about such a complex issue as a planetary crisis. Then the other thing is that the use of Anthropocene elides colonial past and capitalist inequalities of the world, given that the history of colonialism, imperialism, by basically positioning it as a concept that lumps all humans together, is a way of giving responsibility in a manner that is not reflective of the history that we've experienced. The other thing that Dana Haraway brings to the table is that even the dating of the Anthropocene is incorrect. We need to go back farther and not just to focus mainly on the industrialization period and the steam engine. The other thing, criticism is that the Anthropocene has become a buzzword. And part of this becoming a buzzword has been because it's quite obscure. It's not specific about what it really is about. And this makes it amenable to be used by in multiple discussions. And the other thing is that the use of Anthropocene creates a political paralysis because by basically centering on the human, then you leave a lot of other components outside of this equation. And therefore to come up with a meaningful dialogue on a way forward becomes very difficult, creating a political paralysis. So there are other concepts, the Capitalocene, the Capitalocene, I don't know whether I'm saying it right, the Ecozoic. So there's been a host of them that have been trying to make sense of what's really going on. And today, as I said, I've mainly chosen to focus on the Capitalocene, primarily inspired by Cedric Robinson's work. And I build on now Jason Moore, who has really adopted the Capitalocene and kind of taken a lead on it. And he says that the Capitalocene does not stand for capitalism as an economic and social system. So when you talk of the Capitalocene, it's not just the economic side that we're talking about. It is not a radical inflection of the green arithmetic. Rather, the Capitalocene signifies capitalism as a way of organizing nature, nature being a multi-species, situated capitalist world ecology. So it's touching on the planetary life in its diversity and completeness. Mark Bryan adds that capitalism is driving us toward extinction, and here extinction, thinking with Donna Haraway, is in terms of slow death. That what is being the way in which we're being extinguished is not immediately, but gradually. And these forms of slow death are what are leading us towards extinction. And so Mark Bryan continues that extinction is more than a biological process suffered by other species. It signifies also the extinguishing of cultures and languages, genocide, and spectrum of biospheric changes understood as anthropogenic. So it's combining, again, recognizing that nature is not just humans or the other than human world, but rather it's a complex whole of the human and the other than human world. But also recognizing within the human world that there are issues of extinguishing cultures and languages. And when I see cultures and languages, as I'll later discuss, I'm seeing here repositories of potential ways to think about climate change, to think about global challenges that are being destroyed. So we are actually as well destroying potential solutions to the challenges that are ongoing in the world, because I'll come back to that later. So at this point then, global conservation having gained such much traction, we also seen some extreme attention and suggestions on how we could move forward. And one of these has been through what is called the Half Earth Project, where Edward Wilson has been the lead thinker here. And they say that with science at its core and our transcendent moral obligation to the rest of life at its heart, the Half Earth Project is working to conserve half of the land and sea to safeguard the bulk of biodiversity, including ourselves. So you can check it on their website. They have this way of modeling what's going on in the world and a way of modeling the solutions that they think should be the way forward of conserving the world, including ourselves. And as well, some attention to the financial side of conservation, whereby you're requested to contribute in order to impel this project towards the direction they see it going. The Half Earth Project, one of the criticisms that has, of course, emerged is if you're going to conserve half of the Earth, which areas are going to be conserved and what is going to happen to those who are situated in those localities. So that is some, but also it seems the Half Earth Project is really built on this separation, as much as it says to safeguard the bulk of biodiversity, including ourselves. It has this separation of humans and nature, which again, as you have already seen, basically limits our ability to actually engage with the current global challenges. So in terms of moving forward then, beyond the solutions such as the ones suggested by Wilson, I'd like to mainly focus on neoliberal conservation. And I do this so that I'll come back to engage with Robinson's work on racial capitalism. And at the current era, the past years, what you've seen or what I've seen myself is that powerful explanatory of what's really going on in the world of conservation is through the analytic of neoliberal conservation. And Rob Fletcher defines neoliberal conservation as referring to a dynamic way in prominent organizations around the world concerned with the biodiversity conservation have increasingly adopted strategies and mechanisms that seek to reconcile conservation with economic development by harnessing economic markets as putative mechanisms for financing nature conservation. So there have been a lot of discussions about what is really neoliberal, what's really neoliberal conservation. And I think here Fletcher's explanation really is quite encompassing in the sense that it does capture the real essence of the neoliberal turn in terms of the financialization of nature, or seeing that the way forward the way forward in terms of neoliberal conservation thinking is that nature can save itself. Basically, thinking with Castray here that if capitalism is inherently biophysical, depends on biophysical environment, including us as humans, then raising capital in the form of finances to basically finance the conservation project, we are basically saying that conservation, nature can basically fund itself. And so this is the logic behind neoliberal conservation. And now what becomes important and critical is to analyze the nuanced ways in which neoliberal conservation is working in different spaces. And today, of course, my focus is on wildlife conservancies, and I haven't really seen an analysis of neoliberal conservation with regard to, with reference to wildlife conservancies. So I see it as well as a new ground that I'm trying to delve into. So as we move on now, zeroing into conservation in Kenya, and just to brief you about some of the discussions that have been ongoing and some of the key figures that have been influencing the discourse of conservation in Kenya has been John Barry and Mordecai Ogada with their recent publication, The Big Conservation Lie. So The Big Conservation Lie is work that the authors have taken basically to educate us about what is really going on when you say conservation. It's not that conservation itself, as we understand it objectively, is a lie, but rather that the way in which it is practiced does not align with the way we would understand conservation. So the big conservation lie is really about exposing the ways in which, by way of saying we're practicing conservation, we have actually done other things of exploiting both humans and the other than human world in Kenya. Wangari Maathai, here she passed on, but she was a 2004 Nobel laureate and really is an influential figure in Kenya's conservation. Her legacy lives on strong through the Green Belt movement, and she fought hard for environmental conservation, especially the Karura forest that is in Nairobi, and during a very oppressive regime of President Moi, and so she suffered a lot for that, but she stands an icon when it comes to think about conservation in Kenya. She's written some work that we can all have a look at. There are also some YouTube films that you could check out, if you want to see some of the inspiring work that women have been doing, the work that women have been doing in Kenya with regard to conservation. The place now I'm taking you is towards the pastoral areas, because today's discussion is mainly it's going to be concentrated on the pastoral areas. This is not to mean that conservation only happens in the rangelands of Kenya, but rather that my work is focused here, and as well I will use it as a critique of conservation in Kenya. So one of the things that has been going on in the rangelands of Kenya after independence was the attempt to think how to organize land and govern land in a meaningful way, taking into account the ways of life of the native people. And so among the pastoral communities like the Maasai, what were called the group ranches were basically designed, and a group ranch basically is a livestock production system as it was defined basically by the Ministry of Agriculture, is a livestock production system or enterprise where a group of people jointly own freehold title to land. So you're sensing an aspect of privatization there. Maintain agreed stocking levels. So we are seeing some sense of carrying capacity here, and herd their livestock collectively. So again, here we are seeing being pointed towards the commons and shared labor, which they own individually. So there's the group ranches can be thought of as commons. So when I talk the commons in the case of Kenya, I'm talking about these group ranches, which are basically allocated with respect as well to the community, if it's a Maasai, for instance, through the sectional or the ethnic groupings. So we did try to take into account the organizational frameworks of these communities. Nationwide, there were 159 group ranches that were created, and 33 of those were in Narok district, which is today's Narok County, where my work is focused. So Just to give you an idea, more concrete idea with a pictorial representation of what a group ranch looks like. I'm sure many of you have heard about the safari tourism in East Africa, and the Masai Mara usually is one of the key destinations there. And around, my cursor can't show anything, but around the Masai Mara National Reserve, these others like Siana, Olderikesi, which is the most southern one, is where I did my work. Naikra, Majimoro, these are basically the group ranches that were created. So when I talk of group ranches, it's these huge segments of land where communities lived in common through their own rules, but they had local leadership that was elected that basically guided and governed life within these group ranches or within these commons. So soon I'll be talking about, part of the privatization and individualization of land, and that will basically involve demarcating or subdividing or cutting into small plots. Now, these huge segments that are in front of us here. And it is within this large, or these commons, where when I talk about wildlife conservancies, that areas of basically for wildlife conservation have been created. So, and in different ways, which I'll explain. So it's good, just keep this image in your mind, and then work with me as we try to kind of enter into this picture and try to see what it's telling us. So to start with, the wildlife conservancies that I'll be talking about today are defined by the under Kenyan law as land that has been set aside by an individual landowner, body corporate, group of owners, or a community for purposes of wildlife conservation. So we can see already here that wildlife conservancies are really focused on wildlife. So conservation, as I said, my abstract in Kenya, has really been treated as, conservation has been treated as basically solely focusing on wildlife. And this is one of the challenges, because what happens to areas without wildlife? Do we mean that there's no conservation that's going to take place there? So this narrowing of definition of what a wildlife conservancy or what conservation is one of the limits that I see in this definition, and as well that could inform the way in which the Kenyan state is kind of practicing and support in its support, or in its ostensible support for conservation is guided by this logic of conservation as wildlife. And the main reason for that is because wildlife is tied to tourism, and tourism is a major economic sector that generates revenue for the country. So if you see the Kenyan state focusing on conservation as wildlife conservation, it's mainly because of the economic aspect behind that. So right now, there are more than 160 conservancies in the country that are covering around 11% of Kenya's area. And the main discussion, or the main energy that drove the creation of conservancies was upon the realization that Kenya was losing its wildlife, and most of the wildlife was actually residing outside of the national reserve and national park, so government protected areas. And so the question was, how do we engage communities living next to these conservation areas so that the wildlife, which is actually like 70% at the time, was living outside of the conservation areas or protected areas, sorry, so that these communities can engage in conservation if you're going to save this 70% of wildlife that lives outside the protected areas. And that's how, through many experiments, I'm not going to go to the history of those pilot projects that came through until wildlife conservancies have now emerged as the innovative strategies to conserve. But basically, that's the kind of the brief history in short. This is a map of Kenya, and the brown areas are the ones that I would like us to focus on. Those are the conservancies, wildlife conservancies in the country. And the area that is pointed in white by the white arrow is the Narok area where I've been looking at. And so you can see it's quite a small area in terms of size compared to the rest of the country. But in terms of tourism activity, this is one of the busiest area when it comes to tourism. As I said, Masai Mara is there. When it comes to wildlife-based tourism, Masai Mara is leading. So it has high density, but in terms of the area is quite small. So now becoming a bit technical here with just to help us understand the types of wildlife conservancies that exist. I'm not going to dwell here too much. If you want to come back to this, we can do that during Q&A, and I can also share my slides later. The Kenya Wildlife Conservation Association, which is the national body that, that basically leads the conservancies in the country, has classified conservancies into 3 categories. The first one being community conservancies, and the second one being private conservancies, and the third one group conservancies. I've organized them in order of basically their number in terms of the area that's covered. So most of the conservancies are community conservancies, followed by private conservancies, and then group conservancies. So when you talk of a community conservancy, this is usually a wildlife conservancy that's established on land that's owned communally. So like the commons that I showed in that yellow image. When you talk of private conservancies, these are created on individual plots of land. So once subdivision has occurred, once people have the individual plots of land, then they can choose what to do with their land, and some choose to create a wildlife conservancy. When it's a group conservancy, this refers to multiple landowners coming together and amalgamating their individual plots of land. So then you end up with a group ownership. So land is key here in terms of understanding the typology of wildlife conservancy. Decision-making processes are different, of course, because of the constitution of the members, and the beneficiaries as well, as you can see here, are different because of, especially of the members. So you see community conservancies are mainly focused on community development projects, while the private conservancies are mainly, focus on the individual benefits, while the group conservancies focus on individual benefits. But those benefits are determined by the amount that you as an individual contribute, the amount of land that you contribute to the group. So if you contribute 5%, your returns will be 5% of the total kitty. So that's just some important details for when we can come in later, and to help me think through this theoretical exploration. So some of the benefits that have been seen to come from wildlife conservancies include the fact that they have secured space for wildlife conservation. They have helped to boost the country's tourism sector. You don't have only to go to Masai Mara and Amboseli national parks in the country, but you can now go to these wildlife conservancies, and that means that there's more space and opportunities to practice pastoralism. To practice tourism. And this as well has led to uptake, or even the local people participating in tourism. Although within the conservancies, it's mainly foreign visitors that go there because the prices are usually higher than in the public conservation areas. Employment of diverse range, whether it's the tour guides, the drivers, hoteliers, and all that. The other thing is the Kenya Wildlife Conservation Association and its related bodies have tried to create awareness about the importance of conservation in Kenya. And at the same time, when it comes to national policy, they have been the body that basically conducts most of the participatory governance by telling people what is going on in terms of a policy and seeking their contributions. The other thing is that wildlife conservancies have managed to link multiple stakeholders in conservation. So NGOs, you see the corporate world, your Bill Gates, if they want to direct money towards conservation projects. So wildlife conservancies have emerged as one of those destinations where these stakeholders are focusing on. The other thing that is outside of business as usual is that through wildlife conservancies, and as we see that the commons are being dismantled in varied ways, wildlife conservancies have become an important platform for communities to organize themselves, not just to discuss issues of conservation, but to discuss issues that are pertinent to a particular group, and as well on how to organize relationship between neighbors or neighboring conservancies or neighboring groups. So this is one of the key areas that I've found to be quite positive in terms of local people finding a way to express themselves and organize themselves. So now starting to think through the neoliberal analytic and to try to see how wildlife conservancies are doing it, from a neoliberal perspective. One of the things, as I said, is that land privatization, with its occurrence, we've seen the emergence of wildlife conservancies, especially in Nassau County where I'm working. And through land privatization, it has created this ownership of areas that are used for conservation based on multiple factors, but mainly through hierarchies of local power. So what I mean by this is that when land privatization occurs, it mainly results in people being allocated land within those commons. But the land in the commons is not of equal potential. So the higher potential lands often end up being allocated to the already influential and powerful people, which you might call the local elites. So that when an investor comes in and they want to lease land to create a conservancy, then those who will benefit from the land leases that come from land being leased for conservation purposes are those who are already powerful because they allocated themselves and their peers or friends land that was highly potential. So through land privatization and creation of wildlife conservancies, we see it as a process of empowering a few, like finalize, Land's End, where you have a few benefiting and the rest of the people bearing the cost and being left out of this largesse. Privatization itself is a process of creating enclosures. And I mean, this is evident in Marx's work, Robinson's work, and Tanelli's work, Blomley's work. We see the process of land privatization being about creating enclosures and basically creation of property. So that in the rangelands now, what happens is that once you have these individual plots, those who can start to fragment their land through fencing and all that. And so it starts to change the whole dynamic of the ecosystem so that the landscape cannot be freely accessed, whether it's by individuals or wildlife. And you have this subdivision of land becoming actually a barrier to practicing something like pastoralism. So it tends to work against the logic that has been there and that has supported pastoralism and as well and wildlife conservation over the years. The other thing is the creation of wildlife conservancies entails this devolution of conservation responsibilities to the people. So previously, when it was mainly the state that was doing the work of conserving through national parks and national reserves, the creation of wildlife conservancies now makes local people and other stakeholders become responsible of the conservation work. And this is part of kind of Coldian thinking of how to extend or allocate less responsibility to people, to individuals on the ground. Now, an interesting factor here is the aspect of financial valuation. So when investors usually come in from outside and they want to lease land for conservation, the fees that are paid for land are usually quite low, but more importantly, the rangelands, now the land of the rangelands, with all its qualities, with all its history, becomes valued only in a financial way. So all the other qualitative measures, qualitative qualities, if we may, actually become condensed in a single valuation, which becomes a form of devaluation because it not only assigns responsibility to the landowners, but it also creates an enclosure where now with the wildlife conservancy, quite often you cannot access it. So you lease it as if you're leasing, as if you're selling kind of fictitious labor to fictitious commodity to the investor. So part of the enabler of wildlife conservancies has been these low fees for land. So if land was highly valued financially, probably it would not have been more possible for investors to invest in wildlife conservancies. And Jacques has done as well, Jacques Polini through the Icon Project we've done much work on this and seen the fees. And now as times are moving, we see the demands for higher fees are creating problems for wildlife conservancies, which as well poses a question of what is the likely future of wildlife conservancies, their current construction. The other thing is the spectacle. This is basically Igo's work, where the ordering and the creation of conservancies is more focused on the tourist appeal. And so it creates this kind of spectacle where, and an example here, the photo I have here is of Richard Branson's camp in the Masai Mara. You can check it on the website, really creating a kind of this ideal wilderness where, as they say, where the Western man is going to relax and move away from the troubles of all the capitalists' work that's they're doing in Europe, basically. But it's this kind of spectacle that sells. Same land, and it becomes created in a certain way that it appeals as a place for rest, for tourism and other activities. But all this, I see it as a devaluation of pastoral work and life. If we think of this land having been belonging to pastoral people and being shaped by having multiple uses, not just for grazing, but also for herbal medicine, for cultural practices, that becomes enclosed. And by so doing, actually, and giving it a financial value, which is quite low, it's a devaluation of pastoral work and life, because all this enrichment that has not been factored into the financial equation actually is basically lost. So we've seen cases where elders have tried to do cultural activities and have been barred from accessing the wildlife conservancies. We've seen cases where herbal medicine that's quite popular among indigenous communities not being possible to access because there are certain rules that govern areas within a conservancy. And so you start to see these changes in terms of how people relate with the land. And we can go on and on about this, but I'll keep it short for now. So at this point, I think we're doing good for time. At this point, it becomes now my task of what really all this means and how we can probably try to think about it if we're going to address those challenges that we see emanating from these wildlife conservancies. And one of the things that we have been seeing is that after privatization and subdivision, where people go into their private individual plots, after some time, people start to realize that it's not feasible to live a pastoral life in a single individual plot. So they start to come back and recollectivize, kind of the commons of the willing, if you may. They start to amalgamate their plots. And those who refuse to open their plots as well, then they are not allowed to join or to enter those commons of the willing. So there's this realization that, we took this step, but actually we don't think it was a good step. So we're going to go back and recollectivize and build commons, recreate the commons, because our life depends on being able to access larger spaces of the landscape. So this is one of the things that I've really seen and makes me wonder what's going to happen, whether we're going to see this occurring more often. The second one is the maintenance of the commons. So in places that are undergoing subdivision, like Old Derikesi, where I was working, what I've seen is, as much as people are being allocated individual land, there have been different phases of subdivision, of delimiting the land. And one of those has been basically saying, okay, we need different categories of land. There's going to be individual plots of land, but there is also going to be an area for where we can build public utilities. So the next point, like schools, health centers, water access areas, salt lakes, and all that. And then you have also instead of creating group conservancies where you first allocate the land, and whoever ends up with land that's feasible for conservation purposes can be able to lease the land. We see now communities saying, no, we are not going to allocate land first. We are first going to create a communal conservancy, and then every person is going to be a member, is going to have a share within this conservancy, and that's what has happened in Old Derikesi. So it becomes this kind of a maintenance of the commons. The other thing is, in terms of resisting this neoliberal trend that tries to individualize and responsibility and basically break down the commons, we are seeing that there's an emphasis on pastoral life-based conservation, So this is where, for instance, we've seen there's a conservancy, for instance, called Nationalite, where local people now start to engage in conservation work as well by creating wildlife conservancies. And they try to organize in such a way that it caters to the pastoral needs, at the same time practicing conservation. And I think this is quite revolutionary when it comes to tourism, tourist thinking, where the tourist idea has been that we need a wilderness that is not dispelled by pastoralists and their pastoral livestock, kind of reimagining the spectacle of the tourists here by showing actually how those landscapes that we think are purely just for wildlife and they can be characterized as wilderness, they are actually spaces that are occupied and that involve people relating with the land through living their lives. So I summarize this as an attempt to create communities of care, and that I see as the kind of resistance of this neoliberal turn when it comes to conservation in the Kenyan rangelands. And I think at this point now, to wrap up, if you think in terms of communities of care, that it's not so much about the property that people are creating and how much money you can make off of it, but the recognition that through the collectivization of already subdivided plots, maintaining the commons, creating public utilities, finding ways of living, conducting wildlife conservancies in ways that support pastoral life-based conservation, and creating these communities of care, then I think that thinking with Cedric Robinson here is going to be key if wildlife conservancies are going to actually be able to engage with the challenges that we're seeing. Because as I say, taking away land takes away relations. It's not only the land, the physical space, the terra, but rather it's taking away the multiple ways that people engage with the land and the kind of care that organizations of care and institutions of care that are existent in those spaces. And if you can be able to rehabilitate these commons, realizing it's not just the space, but rather what goes on within those spaces, it will take us to think with Cedric Robinson here, where he says that focusing on, reflecting on slavery and what really enabled the kind of resistance that was advanced by or organized by the enslaved, we can think about the pastoral commons and the wildlife conservancies the same way if you're going to rescue conservation at the same time to ensure prosperity of pastoral livelihoods. So Cedric Robinson says that for those African men and women whose lives were interrupted by enslavement and transportation, it was reasonable to expect that they would attempt and in some ways realize the recreation of their lives. It was not, however, an understanding of the Europeans that preserved those Africans in the grasp of slavers, planters, merchants, and colonizers. Rather, it was the ability to imaginatively create a precedent metaphysic while being subjected to enslavement, racial domination, and repression. This was the raw material of the Black radical tradition. So the same here, I advance that for a Black radical tradition in conservation, it has to take to foreground not purely wildlife conservation as the Kenyan state has shown through the definition of wildlife conservancies, but actually putting the life of owners of land in the pastoral areas, in the rangelands. And that way we can rehabilitate institutions and ways of life that are managed to support life over centuries. And by doing so, by valuing those aspects rather than devaluing them by condensing them in a financial valuation, we probably might see a future that appears right now so elusive. So I'll stop there and we can get in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Kariuki. Yeah, great, super well-timed and thorough and comprehensive presentation around this. So thank you very much. And it shows that this is your sort of adieu to Miguel with how kind of well you put this together. So we'll open up to questions. Perhaps Kariuki and I and maybe Carmen can sort of scour the list of people to see hands up, etc. And of course, feel free to just speak if you're not interrupting. Maybe just to begin, Kariuki, if you could, because you mentioned a few times sort of the notion of spectacle, and perhaps of a few sort of alternative spectacles, kind of counter spectacles, so to speak. I guess I'm just wondering if you speak to some of the perhaps more consequential and or contested channels through which spectacles of this kind are broadcasted.
Right. So when it comes to wildlife conservancies, and we can extend that as well to the national parks, the national reserves, this spectacle of that's shaped basically by the tourism or the tourist appeal. What it does is that spaces that could previously be occupied by pastoralists become violently guarded, and so to ensure that pastoralists do not despoil the view of the tourist. So in the area that I'm working in advocacy, what I've seen is this place where as well the conservancy has been set basically shows clearly that it's a nice view that's that's prepared for the tourists. But actually, the chief of the area told me, but we do not allow people to come here, during the day because that's not what the tourists don't want to see cows and goats. They want to see, they want to see the wildlife. The other thing is building on Mordecai's and Barry's work here. They give a good example of how that kind of organization in preparation to create a spectacle works, whereby one of the authors was working with a tourist camp called Tortillas, and the manager basically, as part of the local project that they were developing, to build a local market and a school, was basically located far away in a different location than where the camp was. And so when the author inquired why this was the case, he was told that it's because we do not want, those Maasai bombers and houses, despoiling the view of Mount Kilimanjaro for the tourists. So while it seems kind of a benevolent act of, conducting or implementing a local project, you see it's actually designed in a way that at the same time oppressive. Kind of reminds me of Savannah Shange's recent work on progressive dystopia, where you have this kind of positive interventions, but actually they're basically backgrounded by this ways of thinking that are actually oppressive in themselves, or contradictory to the general idea of positive contribution.
So we have, thank you very much. We have a question from Jacques and Kit, and I'll just read first because we do have a question that was posed a few moments ago by Jennifer. So Jennifer Craig's question is, do you think Black Marxism should be part of the anthropology discipline's canon? Is this a must read for decolonizing the historical context of anthropology work? Thank you, Jennifer, for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for that. I would actually say yes, because actually, as I was introducing Cedric Robinson, he actually did social anthropology at UC Berkeley. So his studying of these issues, even though he is engaged a lot as well with political science, is very much engaged, has a lot of anthropology into it, the discussions that we have, and disturbs this kind of a universalizing idea, Marxist ideas of a kind of a universal proletariat, and contextualizes kind of, this Black history. And at a time when, of course, we realize how diverse the world is, I would say, yes, we need it. And I think it helps us to advance, our ways of thinking when we talk about, challenging the powers that be. It's absolutely necessary. The other thing I think is, as we've seen when it comes to discourse about racism, we see a lot of, I would call it, a kind of shallow analysis in terms of, like as I was saying, it's because of the color of the skin, rather than really trying to understand the historicity of all this, and therefore locating it in ways that are actually that speak, like Robin Kelly says, who I said is a good student of Cedric Robinson. Often people think racism is about color, but it's not. Racism is about power. So if we think in that way, even when you're trying to, to think about our workplaces, our universities, and all that, that kind of thinking, I think, it shapes our challenges, our ways of thinking in a productive way that can enable us to move forward, rather than building on a basis that is not correctly informed.
Thank you. We'll go with Jacques, then Kit, and then Andrew. Jacques.
Yeah, thank you, Kariuki. Thank you for your presentation. That was great. So the question to ask you to engage a little bit more concretely by giving maybe some examples. In your case study, in Olderkesi or in Mara, what is resistance and what is not resistance concretely? What is black Marxism? What is not black Marxism? If you were a black Marxist in Mara or in Olderkesi, what policy will you welcome? What policy will you oppose? For example, privatization, is that reflecting colonization, or is that reflecting resistance to colonization? What about also the fact that most of the Maasai, at the moment, they welcome privatization. They want it, they call for it. Maybe for bad reason, maybe for good reason, that's another issue. And also capitalism, do they welcome or do they oppose capitalism? Because in Mara, you have a number of Maasai capitalists, successful entrepreneurs. They just get the money, make it work. They don't do the work themselves, so they fit well the definition of the capitalist entrepreneur. But what's interesting is that they are the role model for many other Maasai. So what is resistance and what is not, and what is black Marxism and what is not, concretely, by giving a few examples?
Right. I think, yeah, this is a very good question that really brings a lot of issues together. So to start with the question of resistance, what does it look like, in a place like Olderkesi where I've been working? I would say it's interesting when you talk about, I'll go back and talk about communities and the heterogeneity. We talk about communities being heterogeneous, but quite often we don't see that broken down in concrete terms and in quite enough a diverse way. So like Olderkesi, not everyone was in support of creating a community conservancy. Not everyone was in support of privatizing the land. So it was through this continuing engagement that they tried to reach consensus. And what enabled that kind of discussion to take place is because of the existing institutions, because, taking into account that Olderkesi is one of the last places to subdivide their land. So there have been, I would say, they've had the institutions that have operated within their life for a long time that help them to deal with these new challenges that come in. And they have these spaces of discourse that try to listen to different voices, as much as I can also go to critique that. But for now, just to stick on the issue of resistance, which gives space for those with different ideas to be listened to. And in the end, reach a point where most people feel satisfied with. In terms of development discourse, in terms of participation, we also know that critique of participation is that participation doesn't mean equity. Some people who are more powerful can voice their ideas, and they have different ways of influencing how participation looks like. And so while reading through the kind of participation is a way of opening a platform for resistance, I'm also aware that it can also mean, subjugating that kind of resistance. So the other thing is, in terms of conservation and the creation of the Wildlife Conservancy, the investor, for instance, is very aware that there are people who feel that going with the conservancy route is probably not the best idea, because they themselves want land to be allocated, not to first create a conservancy, but first allocate the land, and then those who want to create a conservancy do so willingly. But for those, he says, he makes the argument that those are the ones who want to capture those areas. So kind of now coming to your other question of successful capitalists. So as theneoliberal says, when capitalist relations enter into a frontier, if you may call oligarchy a frontier, what happens is that you end up with these few successful people. And again, I'll build on Igo and Brockington here, where they say one of the interesting things in neoliberalism, it is always very promising. It has these wonderful promises where everyone feels that they'll have an opportunity to succeed. And so that it's interesting you say, you know, people see those as models of success and everyone aspires to be them. That's what neoliberalism does. It gives these promises, but they never become achieved because it presents a cake that appears so big that everyone can have a piece of it, but it never really happens that everyone gets a piece of it. So in terms of Black tradition, radical tradition coming to bureaucracy, I'll say I think it's already in practice to some extent that these local institutions, they're building on what has basically held the community life and held the people of the community together over the years to actually think about these new challenges. And that's why we see, for instance, sorry for those who are not as familiar as Jack and a few others about the Mara and Narok landscape. If we think of the place like Majimoto, where Kimaran comes from, for example, we see that there was not a kind of a platform to engage with and create a community conservancy, but more of what you might call elites grabbing the high potential lands and the proceeds from conservation going to a few. But we see in Oderkesi, they have not only created a community conservancy, but they're also creating public utilities that make sure that everyone benefits from this, recognizing that sitting back and thinking, how does life work? How do we operationalize our life? We need a school, we need a health center. So in different villages, the 25 villages that they have these public spaces that are meant basically to benefit everyone. And they set those aside so that they're not under control of only a single individual. And I see that again as a form of resistance to the neoliberal push towards individualizing and creating property, especially of that which has the most potential financial return.
Thank you very much, Jacques and Kariuki. Now we'll go with Kit, followed by Andrew and Justin. So Kit, you have the floor.
Hi, first, thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. I've heard bits and pieces of your work so far, and it's really interesting to see the wider picture. I'm very curious about this discussion of demarcating land, because the way that it sounds like what's going on is there's this sort of artificial division of the land over what is generally a contiguous space. And to me, from an ecological perspective, that doesn't seem like it would work in terms of conservation, because of course what happens on non-conservation land would certainly likely affect conservation land in terms of weather patterns, in terms of pesticide use or any of those kinds of things. And so I'm wondering what kind of conversations about the demarcation of contiguous space were happening, and if that was even like a relevant conversation at all, particularly in terms of the recreation of the commons.
Right. Yeah, I think this is extremely important, and this is a question that I think also our ICON project has been trying to engage with. It's been interesting the way that subdivision has occurred, or the demarcation into individual plots has occurred. Like I showed there, my work is mainly in the south of Kenya, right, in Narok County, and we see other larger areas that have conservancies in other parts of. Sorry, I should put my mic closer just in case. We see other parts of Kenya where there are even larger conservancies, and from the table that I showed, we see that community conservancies are the most dominant in this Kenyan world of wildlife conservancies, which means that conservancies that have been created that occupy the most space in the country are actually those under community land ownership. So the subdivision kind of tide has taken more root in the southern of Kenya, and John has written about this, of how, funny enough, it has spread mainly, kind of followed a trend from Nairobi, kind of the main urban center, which you might consider to be, if you talk of capitalism and business activities, to be more vibrant, and gradually spread to the other areas. So if you look at the older case, which I'm saying is one of the last ones to subdivide, you can see also spatially, it's one of the furthest from this kind of areas where you have this economic vibrancy. And so when it comes to discussing or talking about demarcation, one of our partners in Kenya, Kimarin, we had a conversation about this, and he was saying, for the Maasai, it's really a strange idea because we've always owned cows, but the idea of owning land is quite foreign to us. So this idea is quite foreign, but people are doing it because there's been a lot of push by the government that explicitly and implicitly. And so, and as people start to subdivide, so if your neighboring community subdivides, like what I've seen in Olderkesi is those who have created enclosures start to treat the enclosures as their dry season, or, if you might want to, we can call it like the low season. They keep forage for the low season, for the dry season, while during the wet season, they go and graze in those areas that still operate as, to some extent, with a greater degree of openness. And so the benefit from the resources in those unsubdivided areas. And when the drought comes, they close the enclosures without allowing those others who have not created these enclosures to access their resources. So the subdivision discussion has these multiple factors that they have to be taken into consideration, because locally as well, you have people with different numbers of livestock who feel by subdividing land, maybe we might have smaller space to keep our cattle. Others feel I might be able to regulate, who can access this space if it was subdivided, and I will not suffer even though I have only a few livestock. So it's never a single dimensioned discussion. It's complex, and it takes years and years. And this is what I've tried to bring out in my discussion, that even though past work has mainly focused on subdivision itself, the process, the intricacies of this process, those discussions, how long they take, different committees in some communities, come and go, and still the subdivision process hasn't happened. Like in Olderkesi, discussions started in 1997. Even now, they have not yet allocated. So it takes long. It's a long-term. There are long-term discussions which see even like generations. Some people pass on, and you find that those who started the discussions are not there anymore, and you're engaging with a newer generation. So even the discussions themselves kind of change with time. So these are some of the complexities that come to when you focus on this aspect of kind of discussion that goes on when it comes to dismantling the commons. I don't know whether I answered your question, Kate.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I'm like nodding along and you can't see me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kit and Kariuki. Now we'll go with a question from Andrew, followed by Justin, and then John.
Thanks, Kariuki. That was really interesting talk, and nice to see you. I'm sure you've seen Jacob Lamini's new book on Kruger National Park in South Africa, or if you haven't, it's called Safari Nation, and is a really nice, I think, doing a lot of sort of interesting things with thinking about presence in these kinds of spaces, and the way that presence shifts over time. And some of my questions you began to address in your answer to the last question. I'm curious whether I really like the way you bring in pastoralism as such a central presence in this space. I'm wondering if what counts as pastoralist life or pastoralist practice, pastoralist relations, is this a stable object over the time period that you're looking at? Is this something that has transformed itself? Does what counts as pastoralism these days, is this something that people are battling over? And is there any risk, or does it come into the picture at all, a kind of phenomenon where pastoralism itself becomes at risk of let's say, falling prey to a tourist gaze, where it's not simply about wildlife, but even a sort of a romanticized view of pastoralism? It's kind of a nested set of questions.
Right, absolutely.
You're all...
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think it's a very interesting question, especially because the spaces we are looking at, some of the questions have really been around that. You know, Jack and John are here as well. We've had many discussions of you know, how does pastoralism look like now? What are people doing with their lives now? Is that part of pastoralism? Is it moving away from? Is it adapting? What exactly can we call it, these changes that we're seeing? As we all know, of course, you know, life is dynamic, changes over time, both based on pressures from inside and from outside. And so in my work, I'm gonna start kind of a negative side. In my work, by virtue of the kind of research we were able to do and how long we can stay there, I was only there for a year. So it was not really an enough period to observe personally myself. But based on conversations with people of all advocacy, what I learned is there have been a lot of changes occurring when it comes to the idea of pastoralism. First of all, with subdivision, and also with conversations from people from other commons. They've observed many changes, and if I can speak to advocacy, for example, with one key example is that, for instance, before they used to have livestock, especially cattle, but now they have shifted from cattle mainly to sheep, keeping sheep, and that's been because of over time. Movement has become restricted. As I showed on the small map, you can see it's on the border with Tanzania. So Tanzanian side government has been kind of enforcing the national border there, which means the Maasai of advocacy cannot go to graze into Tanzania as they used to before. So that limits the kind of landscape you can access as a pastoralist. The other thing is with with subdivision and as well as changing patterns and increasing population, so kind of changing pressures on land. We've also seen, you know, increase in agricultural activities, the closure of kind of routes to access further commons or further pastures. And one of the things is that has meant if you can't access a pasture that was close by and you have to go really far. Some of the people were telling me from a different group area that are subdivided before, that one of the things they're seeing in the challenge is that by going much further away, they are also starting to encounter new diseases that they were not familiar with. So they're being exposed to this kind of new environments by way of diseases that actually now movement becomes a liability, because you might even lose your cattle, not only to the drought, but also these new diseases, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think I would characterize it as has been very dynamic. And when it comes to the tourism sector, the entry of wildlife conservancies is changing the game in the sense that I feel that in an area like Olderkesi, where much of what's going on is expectation and kind of waiting for things to happen so that the conservancy takes place, or is put in place and people can benefit. There is a lot of hope about what is going to come with the conservancy. But when you talk with people who have been in places where conservancies have already been established, there is not as much enthusiasm in many of them, but a few maybe that feel that, okay, our conservancy does all than the others because they allow us to, to access grazing areas during the dry season. In some areas, they feel, no, we need to completely terminate this contract because we can't access these pastures, and also in terms of the water access, it's difficult. And if you access, the penalty is extremely high. It's ridiculously high. I don't know the logic behind that. And I hope to understand someday, because a single infraction, if you contribute an acre of land and you basically end up leading your cattle to the conservancy area, the fine that you're given is equal to the amount of money that you would get in a year. So basically, by paying a fine, you've given up an acre's worth of a whole year. So you see there's a high kind of punishment, but the logic behind it, I think, is that if you punish so extremely, then you deter people from doing it. But the reality of the matter is, no matter what kind of penalties you put, people, when they have to graze, usually will try to access those areas that have pasture. And I think also Graham's work in northern Kenya has shown that. So I think that's why that's how I would respond to your question.
That's super interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew and Kariuki. Now we will go with Justin, followed by John.
Great, thanks, KK. This is seems like you've really pulled it together quite well. The first one is just sort of a comment that kind of segues from what you were just talking about, which is the concept of discipline. And I was kind of listening for it to see how it would come up. But I think you have Rob Fletcher on your committee, right? So there's a 2010 article by him I find quite useful, 2009 or 10 or something, neoliberal environmentality. And to me, the discipline would be sort of like when people have internalized things and they sort of regulate their own behavior. And I sort of heard more of the kind of top down and then resisting that top down. So if there was a discipline, to me, there wouldn't be that same kind of resistance. But, you know, maybe there's also degrees, right? There's the James Scott sort of hidden transcripts, and people might discipline themselves in some ways and then resist in other ways as well. So that's more of just a comment. I had a couple other small questions that you don't necessarily have to answer here, but might be useful for you to think about. In the context of neoliberal conservation, I was kind of wondering, what's the tax structure of these different conservancies in terms of like how involved the state is in regulation, like in terms of rent seeking and what cut they get. And I think that would help to sort of sharpen things in terms of thinking about how private the nature is versus the central government. I was wondering as well about what kind of wider context there is about land use change outside of conservancies, and whether there's sort of trends towards fragmentation, and that might be from conversion to agriculture. And, you know, I would imagine there's probably a lot of competing interests in these lands. And so in that sense, you might find people or pastoralists that in some ways align themselves with these conservancies because they can become tools to maintain large plots of land and prevent that sort of land use change that does serve their interests. I was wondering as well kind of about the scale of your analysis, like sort of how representative your theoretical interests are in terms of the people on the ground and across which area. And could you say with sort of some authority whether they generally oppose these areas or support them, or if there's a lot of nuance and that sort of thing? And then the final sort of just building from that is that in my experience, there seems to be like property on paper and then often in practice. And I think John's 2016 article really speaks well to that. He has some cases there, I think, where there was a more private arrangement, but then the pastoralists sort of actually just moved on to the area and started re-managing it in a common way. And I've seen similar things where I was, where there was sort of these informal agreements that came to be, even though there was technically restrictions. So those are sort of some questions that maybe you don't have to answer now, but you could think about, I guess.
Right. Yeah, those are indeed very important questions. And of course, as we all know, Justin has been doing his work in Tanzania. So we're just neighbors there, maybe in the southern of Kenya and him in Tanzania. So a lot of related issues. In terms of discipline, and especially with regard to the state, I agree with you that, you know, with even with Agral's work with kind of internalizing, you know, kind of internalizing these behaviors that are expected to generate benefits when it comes to conservation, or to result in conservation benefits. And the way that, you know, for instance, conservancies, you can see that they are attempting to mainly apply, you know, this kind of disciplinary governmentality of sorts by punishing these the intruders, if you may. And this is usually sutured by the kind of land lease contracts. So the details are really, when you look at the contracts that are signed between the community and the investor, that's where really the details are, of which basically transfer power from the real landowners to the investors who lease land for a given period of time. And most of these contracts, they're, even myself when I read, these are they're not easy to understand. I was talking to one of the leading people in conservation in Kenya, and we were talking about these contracts. And he was saying he suspects, based on the few he has seen, that they are actually produced or manufactured at a single place in Nairobi, where basically there's a replication of that. And I think within the matter, talking of the scale of analysis, and which we've seen with Jack, is there's a kind of a club of investors. So the investors become a club of people. They create a group where basically you lease land at a certain amount. You don't exceed a certain amount, and that basically maintains prices on the landscape. So it's not as if you talk of market influence or based on the negotiation power and skills of people that influences the kind of land lease rates. It's more of the investor controlling that kind of debate, and so you have really standardized lease fees and a lot of others. The contracts, they look quite similar and all that. So you see there's a kind of a larger, I don't know whether you can call it a creation of a kind of hegemonic of a corporate hegemonic of sorts in these areas. So and that, by having those contracts in place, then it becomes the state, the language of the state, because any infraction, then the investor can enforce it. If matters get worse, they have the support of the state, because also the state is in support of these wildlife conservancies. So there are those hierarchies of authority that come into being just by leasing, signing that contract. So, and I think this is where we can think in terms of disciplining, in terms of, with documents. I think Anna Riles does a good work of, analyzing documents and what they do in terms of organizing life and basically gaining command over life. In terms of property, like I said, so in the Kenyan, Maasai area, I come from central Kenya, where private ownership, individual ownership, that's all I know since I was born, and even my parents, that's what they've grown to know. So it's something that I grew with, is something that's so naturalized. So it was interesting for me in an interesting way to see a place, to be in a place where it's not, my own kind of thoughts become challenged by the way people think about land. Like, Kimaran telling me that the idea of owning land is strange. It gave me a good example of after subdivision in the Majimoto group ranch, an old lady sold her all of her land, but the money ran out before she moved out of the plot. So when the guy came to kick her out, she said, "There's no way my money can be finished for the land, and the land is still here. So there's no way you can kick me out, because if my money is finished, the land should be finished too, but it's still here. So you must be lying to me." So they had to make other arrangements to, add her the money and move her out. And that's the way, this idea of owning land is not, it's still quite new, and it's not thought of in the same way. So even property relations, if we might talk about those, they're very different in different places, and advocacy and other places, especially those that are subdividing now. You see the way people are thinking about land is very different from maybe from where those relations have changed over time. And now I think the idea, the practices of people recollectivizing their plots of land, I think it's an interesting way, how people push for subdivision and then realize this probably doesn't work the best for us, and we need to recollectivize and kind of create the commons of the willing, something that I'm actually quite interested in to explore further. I find that to be quite interesting in terms of challenging, some scholars have noted privatization is really the glue that holds together, neoliberal capitalism. So if people are moving, kind of moving back, taking a step forward and then back to not really individualize and create these individualized plots of land, but rather kind of private commons, then what does that mean for the spread of these capitalist relations that kind of organize property in certain ways? So I think we're going to be seeing different patterns in different places. As well, the investors are quite influential. In order to KCAC, they're part of the value that's seen in wildlife conservancies is also the kind of local development that the money they help to pull in, not through paying, like a visitor's fee, but rather like partnering with NGOs who are going to build a bridge, who are going to build a school, and that is presented. Again, maybe this could also fall in the spectacle as work that's being done by the conservancy, even though the work of the conservancy is to use their skill of communicating and bringing other development agents to do development work within those spaces that actually boosts the image of the conservancy and the investor to the community.
Thank you very much, Justin and Kariuki. And now I cede the floor to John.
Thanks, Nick. KK, this was a wonderful presentation. I thought I knew pretty much what you were doing, having worked through all your chapters, but I saw there's a scope of intellectual exploration which goes even farther, and I look forward to working through this material with you. I just wanted to go to the last slide of your presentation. You don't have to put it up. It's a list of things that are really represent some combination of sensible approaches to land, forms of resistance, or what one at a particular moment in time seems to be resistance to the mishandling of land and subdivision, et cetera, which you so nicely described. I was interested that list of things. By the way, the reamalgamation of land, the areas of Amboseli actually have some of those processes, so we should probably look carefully at some of those cases. I didn't see wildlife conservation, which is very interesting because you could read your whole the whole development of your ideas as saying, let's chuck the conservation goal process because it's just tied up with external domination, neoliberal pursuits, etc. Let's let people live their own lives. And so I just wanted to say, what if you added wildlife conservation? What would that look like in the context of communal living and self-organization that you might see there? So that's one question. The other, going right back to the beginning, essentially you developed a critique of Marx. And I've always thought Marx's take on imperialism and colonialism to be pretty good, really taking into account a lot of important issues. And one of the things you see there is that Marx was not a romantic. He didn't say, let's go back to the way things used to be in peasant life, etc. He was very much a progressivist. And he saw capitalism not as something that was feeble and should be pushed aside. He looked at it as a stepping stone to something better. And so I'm sort of intrigued by the end point where you seem to say, let's let people, the pastoralists, lead their own lives. And while generally I support that, it seems to me people can make their own decisions about what they're going to do. It struck me that most of them might more agree with Marx's original position, which is to say, we like clinics, we like markets, we like social services and schools and things like that. Our argument isn't this sort of thing, it's that we feel we're being cheated out of those things. The whole theme of corruption, which you just enumerated a whole set of perspectives on essentially the corruption of the system, and that you're talking about basically a protest movement against that, which I fully support. But so those are really two questions. Where's wildlife conservation, and what about the changing conditions? This really goes back to Andrew's question. The changing conditions under which people carry out animal husbandry these days, which of course takes full recognition of the range of institutions that come essentially from the state.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and it's interesting as well as myself reflecting on it, how it kind of organically evolved within my thinking, because politically, the project that I see here is one that is trying to kind of, I would say, rehabilitate the position of the pastoral peoples and the indigenous communities because of the violence that we've seen that comes with conservation as practiced, not basically as preached, but the way it's practiced. And the expose of WWF, for instance, was one of those key instances. But these are violence acts that happen every day, and so conservation, to some extent, by attempting to organize landscape in a way that separates humans from nature, that creates that kind of bifurcation, tends to punish people in the name of saving other form of life. So my project was kind of to fight back against that, and say we do not need this is not correct. Conservation should not be about violence, because at the heart of it, conservation, for me, I see it as life. And that's why my critique of the conservation as wildlife conservation is what happens to those parts of the country, of the landscape that do not have wildlife. Are we not going to do conservation there? Because we've seen, for instance, Central Kenya, well, some of the things that have been happening, and this is, ties into part of this kind of conservation idea of conservation, is some of the key water sources. There have been attempts to actually privatize those and control water intake, yet people are the ones who plant trees. For me, growing up, for instance, even people with small plots of land would have a small section towards a stream or towards the end where they had a small forest. We never asked why, but it was just a way of doing, and later on I started to see why people would have it always a forested small section, and these sources of water were always guarded and continue to be guarded by people in the way they relate, that we cannot stay without water, and water is guarded in so many ways, whether it's in practice or through other cultural ways. And I see that with the stories that I hear, when I talk with many Maasai friends. It's the idea of, the kind of antagonism between wildlife and people is manufactured not just by the project of conservation itself, but also by the pressures of neoliberal capitalism, where what is considered to be living the life of belonging in a modern world. So kind of challenging modernity here as being responsible for creating some of these troubles, the health center, not so much the health center, but other the everyday kind of selling of labor and the concentration of the means of production within few hands, and then the rest is all being expected to pay school fees, for instance. These demands that generally require you have to have money to pay your school fees. You need to have money to pay for for food, and all these normal things that gradually change. Tanya Lee talks of piecemeal changes that you cannot even detect if you're not looking closely enough. Continue to change, and these demands continue to pour on people, so that you start to think of ways that how am I going to get money to pay my kids' school fees? Progress in the country is means building sky rises and working in the skyscrapers in Nairobi and all that. How am I going to take my the idea of modernity? So to think with Ferguson here, has become so naturalized, so that whatever is the kind of life that is that doesn't subscribe to those kind of ideas becomes positioned as kind of backward and being left behind, so that people will say, no, we also want that. We want to subdivide because others have subdivided and they have been able to build their own houses and all that. But what usually I see is not mentioned is the cost of this kind of modernity. I don't want to call it progress so much, but this kind of modernity, the cost of it, the kind of having a community fallback. We see that in my earlier anthropology courses, we had this discussion about, even in European countries where we might consider to be more capitalistic, we see that, in Karl Polanyi's way of thinking of counter movements, that the economies themselves develop these ways of taking care even for those who do not have enough income. But we don't have those in Kenya. We don't have those in many of these countries. So it's, they say Kenya is a place where it's a pit where it has no end. If you fall, you just continue falling because you don't really have these mechanisms like the ones they're trying to develop in South Africa in James Ferguson's work, where you basically have a level that you cannot go below under. So these are some of the pressures that are not generally generated within the rangelands, but generally generated within a larger space of modernity that are forcing people and making people to work towards certain directions. And in the end, they become antagonistic to think about what life is commodity, and therefore we have to think, if it occupies the space, we need to think in terms of opportunity cost, but not in terms of how this life has coexisted with livestock. Like some have pushed back in the National Eye Conservancy, showing that livestock and wildlife can coexist. So I think that the example of the National Eye Conservancy is a good one where, I haven't delved so much into it, but based on the stories I've heard and some of the interviews we conducted, they seem to me to be a model that's challenging these creating fortresses of conservation to the extent to which that becomes taken up and maybe replicated and those kind of values taken up. We have to wait and see. I don't know which direction it's going to go. I think to some extent that addresses both questions, with Marx as a progressivist and dying for progress. So yeah, I think that's what I can say for now.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, John, and thank you, Kariuki. Floor is still open for questions. For a few more. Yes, Colin. Floor is yours.
Hi. I was interested to hear the turn of phrase. I think it was human-wildlife conflicts as manufactured crisis or something like that. And I also found myself wondering, as John did in relation to his first question about conservation, what the discourse is in contexts of recollectivization. In many indigenous contexts, there is a discourse of stewardship and custodianship, which is preferred to a language of conservation, and one could see that discourse of stewardship as a dimension of environmentality, or, as many indigenous actors are insisting, it's a translation and expression of a pre-existing relationality, and so I wonder, what, as you talk about the possible compatibilities of grazing with wildlife and coexistence, is there a sentiment of affection or of beauty or of the sacred attaching to people's sense of place and informing an impulse to recollectivization, more collective and communal kind of relationship with the general environment?
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And I know John has written some work on this I just bumped into recently. I still have to read that paper, but based on my, I would say, relatively shorter experience, both personally, physically being there and also learning from my friends and other colleagues. it's interesting. In advocacy, for example, there are some people who didn't want to hear anything about wildlife. They felt, we don't want it doesn't help us. And an interesting question that I was sometimes asking people was, why should we conserve wildlife? And I can't remember anyone having a concrete answer. Is we should conserve wildlife because it was that kind of relationship that almost doesn't, I take it as a relationship is so natural that it doesn't have words to describe it. And that you frame that as a question surprises people. So I thought it's a kind of a relationship that maybe as an anthropologist, you can only observe. And part of it is part of my observation and conversation took it in the direction where actually they say, someone said, I remember that even the lion, even though he eats the cows, we still call it the wild cow. Not actually the buffalo, but the lion, we call it the wild cow. So which is, like a cow being very close to a pastoralist, to a Maasai, then calling the lion as a wild cow is actually quite interesting in thinking about these kind of relations, because you would expect that, normally if lion eats livestock, then people will have this kind of antagonistic relationship with the predator, but it's not really the case. And in Matter North Conservancy, they have developed this program where they try to kind of engage with the these new challenges of relating between humans and wildlife, and trying to see what are the ways in which we can exist without hurting each other. And part of that has come in the way of creating the shelters in a certain way. So they teach people within their conservancy how to build shelters that make sure that hyenas and leopards cannot get into the shelters where sheep and goat are kept. And if indeed it happens that despite those efforts, your livestock was eaten by a predator, then they have a compensation program, and they don't call it compensation; they call it reconciliation. A reconciliation kind of kit or fund that they give to people, because they say you cannot compensate. It's not a direct, exchange. It's not an equal exchange. It's more of a reconciling the relationship, and saying, as we say in Swahili, pole, which translates to sorry that we are sorry this happened, and so this is basically it's conciliatory kind of fee. I am not sure how this is going to, with pressures that are not wildlife related, people trying to think, having the pressure of money, given the way, life continues to operate in Kenya. And people are so much under pressure of money, whether it's to buy food, to pay school fees, and do many other things. And as John was saying, aspiring to this kind of modernity. And these pressures, what kind of activities do people see that will help them be able to do this? And part of this, I think Jacques has been making the argument of people going towards agriculture because it generates quick money, but also combining with doing things differently that assure faster returns to your labor, basically. And some of these activities are some of the ones that investors, conservationists, and investors are worried about, because most of them are quite antagonistic to wildlife conservation. So how are they going to balance this to ensure that fragmentation, where people, if you plant crops, you don't put up a fence because you don't want wildlife and others to encroach, but we need that kind of landscape openness. I think this is where now the collectivization comes in, as people try to save themselves by doing so, also to end up maybe saving wildlife, because by kind of rehabilitating and rescuing pastoralism, they also kind of rescue a mode of life that kind of encourages a more positive relationship. But in terms of whether people think directly simply about the zebras and the buffaloes and the hyenas, it's not something that came up about more than them saying, we know if you want to see the hyenas there, this is a place where there are most of them, so we don't go to graze there and things like that and all that. So it's not a relationship that I felt was being negotiated so much beyond people saying, when I have my own plot, I'll fence it so that I can keep grass and make sure that, you know, wildlife doesn't access it. But it's not like, I don't want to see wildlife, and so I don't hear anything about it. It's more of people thinking about themselves more than the relationship. And but now with these incentives that they seek to, you know, to kind of have a financial way of doing it, I feel if they only go the financial route, it's going to be short-lived. The money that they'll need to, that will be needed to pay, just basing everything on money is not going to be enough. And that's why I call for the, you know, to think with Cedric Robinson, with the Black radical tradition, where different forms of life are become valued. And by doing so, then we can think beyond just the human needs, but and think about, some people mentioned about, you know, we also need our future kids to see this wildlife and not to be selfish and finish it all. So we need our future kids to see, you know, this, what makes the you know, the rangelands is partly wildlife. So that kind of thinking, I think, is about, you know, helping to alleviate these pressures, and that will call for not only the people themselves, because you know, it's another discussion with the post-colonial state, and you know, Mbembe's work has been quite instructive for me to think about, you know, the post-colonial state and its responsibility or irresponsibility to the citizenry, and kind of not addressing this, you know, Polanyi's counter movement of, you know, establishing kind of welfare programs for that. Some are pushing for that, but I don't know exactly to what extent we can, if we think of conservation more broadly. In areas without wildlife, we've seen the outlawing of cutting even trees. We know that wildlife crime is penalized hugely. So it's more been a disciplinary kind of governmentality, but I think we need more than just, you know, enforcing discipline and you know, pinning everything on the people. So I think it's a huge challenge. I don't have really an answer on what's the way forward, but I think through dialogue and involving multiple stakeholders could probably help us to, you know, to see what are some of the possibilities of enhancing this kind of relations, more than, you know, multi-species kind of relationships.
Wonderful. I believe that hand raised was from John was goodbye, but Carolyn, I believe you have a question.
Hi, Kariuki, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. This is just a quick question because I was very struck by your theoretical framework and your use of Jason Moore, and one quote that you mentioned on the Capitalocene, reorganizing the world into a type of green arithmetic. And recently I've been doing some reading on conservation finance, increasingly using Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and these types of new forms of capital that seem to not have this sort of moral bias that the market might have, and yet they are being mobilized by conservationists and investors seeking access to land. And the corporate world, of course, is involved in these kinds of new conservation finance efforts. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the conservation finance aspect of this within the context of the green economy today. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I think this is really interesting times with the finance and in cryptocurrency, especially Bitcoin, which has actually as well gained root in Kenya, but more in the urban areas. The financial aspect has is also very political to some extent. First of all, we have so some of the conservationists in Kenya feel that what they need to do to secure wildlife is to make sure they pay enough money so that basically it makes more sense to conserve wildlife than to do any other activity like maybe farming, right? So kind of paying for the opportunity cost of what someone would do if they didn't engage in conservation. The other direction has been the involvement of the bingos, the big international non-governmental organizations in conservation. We have the NRTs and we have African wildlife conservation and all that. And one of the criticisms that has come from this literature on financialization is how much of the money that goes through bingos actually is used to fund strategies that are not aligned with the indigenous ways of life. And I think the WWF report expose, that showed, the atrocities, violence that was visited against the indigenous peoples in Cameroon, in the Congo, in Asian countries as well. I forget which country, but basically that there's a kind of a militarized conservation, which Elizabeth Landstrom at Toronto at York is talking about, focusing more on the Southern African side. There's a lot of investment in the militarized conservation, and this is huge investments where you have state-of-the-art military security strategies being tested out in conservation. Drones, and she has an article where she shows the kind of money that goes into this militarization, and money that if it was invested in communities would bring so much change. So there's still the logic of kind of fortress conservation. We see that even when the finance is coming, quite often is still organized or follows the institution of a fortress kind of conservation. And so you find it empowers the disciplinary side of the disciplining side of conservation, rather than enhancing the life of those people who live with wildlife. So that's one of my main worries. And I don't know, with Bitcoin, my understanding of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin so far is its efficiency is more of avoiding all the bureaucratic steps. I haven't really read some of the work that's going on in terms of land transactions, like in Rwanda and all that. There's a prof, it's Carlton, that's a friend of mine that's doing that work. I have to engage in this work more to see how what that could mean for wildlife conservation. But in terms of conservation finance, I see a lot of it being invested. And actually, Mordecai's work, I forgot to mention here, he has a wonderful talk on YouTube on this book. He did a few years ago, The Big Conservation Lie, and he was also part of the ICON project. And he shows some of the projects where this money, we have these sanctuaries where people pay to give a name to an elephant or to a wildlife animal, and this money is never really are involved in projects that don't have huge impact, but they are spectacle. They make you feel like you're doing so much, but when you look on the ground, there's not much change that's happening. So I think that's where the challenge for conservation finance, maybe as much as I criticize the financialization aspect, the softer side of it, if we're doing kind of a compromise, I would think is part of this, doing away with this, middle bureaucratic steps and interventions that are there to, the whole thing about the big conservation lie is doing things in the name of conservation, but really not having results on the ground, and really investing in those communities that live with wildlife and that live with wildlife. If you can think of strategies of connecting, those impactful projects with a kind of support that can be provided, I think that could be a step, even empowering, thinking a way out of a purely financial way. I think we will need finances to support a revolution against capitalism itself, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Kariuki. And thank you everyone for having attended. This has been a very fun, engaging, thorough, and kind of nonstop event. So thank you very much, Kariuki, for putting together this very thoughtful and engaging talk. Thanks everyone for your great questions, to those who were here and to those who are here. I can say that there's a lot of really, both kind remarks towards you, Kariuki, in the group chat, but also some very interesting points that have been brought up, and it kind of makes me just really take stock of how there's always experts in the room at any of these events, but it's nice when you kind of notice how much overlap in expertise there is. And today we've had just you know, from the way that the comments were said, the questions were asked, you can really tell that there's a lot of overlapping expertise here. I think that's in many respects a testament to John's work with ICANN, but also just with all of your work, you know, doing what you do. And of course, to have other people swing around and have the ability to kind of at least still understand and speak to that is testament to Colin's work with Cicada. And so anyways, I just want to thank everybody and to say that I'm happy and proud to be part of this. And I want to welcome you all to next week's talk, where Bjorn Reichhardt will be presenting a talk entitled Dairy Cultures, Milk Fermentation, Heritage and Microbial Biogeographies in Mongolia, which should be pretty fun. So stay tuned for a poster about that. And thank you again, Carmen, for helping put this together. And of course, Colin for backing us throughout all this. So thank yous and congratulations, Kariuki, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the wonderful discussion. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you,
Likewise.
Kiki. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sweet. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Have a good one.
Thanks, you too.